Welcome back for another deep dive. You ready to get into it?
Always.
Awesome. Well, today we're going to be talking all about Morgan Housel's The Psychology of Money, right?
Yes.
So we've got a few excerpts from the book, and I think it'd be really interesting to kind of look at the psychology behind, how we make financial decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, traditional finance would assume that we're all like perfectly rational, like Spock from Star Trek, right?
Right.
We make decisions based on spreadsheets and algorithms.
Right.
But Morgan Housel kind of throws that idea out the window.
Yeah, I like how he starts off with this idea that no one is crazy,
Yep.
right? When it comes to money,
Right.
we've all seen people make like financial decisions where we kind of like scratch our heads and we're like, what? Like, what were they thinking?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But his point is that everyone's financial decisions make sense when you look at it through the lens of their own experiences.
Right.
And he uses the example of Ronald Reed. This guy was a janitor, and he quietly amassed an $8 million fortune.
Oh, wow. A janitor, $8 million. That's amazing. How did he do that?
So basically, he would just save consistently, he would invest in quality companies, and most importantly, he let compounding work its magic for decades.
Right, right.
But the people who knew him, like his friends and family, thought he was just a regular guy. Nobody knew he was a multimillionaire.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's like it challenges our assumptions about who can actually build wealth,
Totally.
You don't have to be some Wall Street guy or win the lottery or something. Like, it really is more about patience and consistency.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think of it like the tortoise and the hare story, but with money.
Exactly. I love that.
Slow and steady wins the race.
Yeah.
And it really leads to another crucial point that he talks about.
Okay.
Understanding where someone is coming from when they make those financial choices.
Right.
If you grew up during like a recession or something, your attitude towards saving money is probably going to be a lot different from someone who grew up during like a period of economic prosperity.
Yeah. So it's like what seems crazy to one person might make perfect sense to another again.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think that's where empathy comes in, right?
Right.
Instead of judging someone for their financial decisions, trying to understand like where are they coming from? What are their experiences with money? And when you look at it that way, their choices might start to make a lot more sense.
It's about like getting into their heads a little bit and seeing the world from their perspective.
Exactly. And then it gets really interesting when Housel starts talking about the role of luck and risk. And he uses Bill Gates, of all people, as the example.
Well, I mean, that's like, I feel like everyone attributes Gates' success to his like brilliance, right? Like he just worked hard and was a genius.
Right.
But Housel's like, hold on a second. There was a huge element of luck involved.
Huge. Like, think about it. The guy went to like one of the only high schools in the entire world that had a computer back in the 60s.
Wow, that's crazy. Yeah, like what if he went to like any other school? Would we even know his name?
Exactly. You have to wonder how many brilliant people are out there that never got that lucky break. And then he contrasts Gates' story with his friend, Ken Evans, who actually died in a mountaineering accident.
That's so right.
So the same age as Gates. They were close friends, and Evans, potentially could have been just as successful, but, just this random event completely cut his life short.
Yeah, it makes you think, Like, I guess we often mistake luck for skill. We love to tell ourselves stories about why people are successful, but a lot of times it really comes down to just being in the right place at the right time, or maybe just like avoiding some crazy risk, right?
Yeah, totally. So next time you see somebody who's super successful financially or otherwise, think about it, Like how much of it might just be due to stuff they couldn't even control.
Totally. And I mean, the other side of that is like if someone is struggling financially, we shouldn't just automatically assume they made bad decisions, right? Like maybe they just got dealt a tougher hand.
Absolutely. So it's really about having some humility.
Right.
And recognizing that both success and failure are way more nuanced than they might appear on the surface.
Right.
Which kind of leads us to another big idea in the book, which is the power of compounding.
Oh, yeah. I love that. The snowball effect, right?
Right.
Like he uses Warren Buffett as an example, and it's like mind-blowing that 99.9% of his wealth came after he turned 50.
I know. It's crazy, right? I mean, like everybody thinks of him as like this investing genius, but in reality, he's just been patiently compounding his returns for like 70 years,
It's crazy. Like $81.5 billion of his wealth came after he qualified for Social Security.
I know. It's wild.
That's amazing. So it's not just about like earning those high returns. It's about like staying in the game for the long run.
Yeah. It's like that saying, time in the market beats timing the market every
Yeah.
time. And, to kind of illustrate this point even further, Housel compares Buffett to another really successful investor, Jim Simons.
Okay.
So this guy, he's compounded money at an incredible rate, like 66% annually since 1988.
Wow. That's way more than Buffett, right?
Way more, but he's still significantly less wealthy than Buffett. And the reason is because he started later in life.
So, like, the difference isn't about their stock picking abilities. It's literally just time.
It's time. It's time. So, even if you're like an average investor, if you start early and you're consistent, you can build a lot of wealth.
That's kind of encouraging.
I know, right?
Like, it's actually doable. It's not like you need to be this financial genius to, like,
No
really have
kidding.
success, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Compounding is like a financial superpower that really rewards patience and persistence. Think about it this way. If you invest $1,000 and you earn, let's say, a 10% return every year, after the first year, you've got $1,100, right? Not bad, right?
Not bad at all.
But then the next year, you're earning 10%, not just on your original 1,000, but on that $1,100. So you end up with $1,210. And it just keeps building and building exponentially over time.
Yeah, so it's like time really is money when it comes to investing, right?
For sure. For sure. And this is something that's important. Like, no matter what you're saving for, whether it's retirement, a down payment for a house, or just an emergency fund, the earlier you start, the more time you have for that compounding to work its magic.
I like it. So that's great for getting rich, but what about staying rich? Like, we always hear these stories about lottery winners who end up broke or entrepreneurs who lose everything overnight.
Yeah.
What's the secret to actually holding on to your wealth?
It's a really good point, and it's a key distinction that Housel makes.
Mhm.
He says that getting rich and staying rich are very different,
Okay.
like different mindsets,
Right.
different skills. And he illustrates this by comparing two guys, Jesse Livermore and Abraham Jermansky. So Livermore was like this Wall Street wizard.
Oh,
He made a fortune during the 1929 crash, but he eventually lost it all and, tragically, ended up taking his own life.
oh, wow. That's a crazy roller coaster. What about Jermansky? What happened with him?
So Jermansky was actually ruined by that same crash.
Oh, wow.
But get this, he might have actually committed suicide right before Livermore made his fortune.
Oh, wow. That's heavy.
It's really heavy, right?
Yeah.
And it just shows how unpredictable wealth can be. It's not just about making money, it's about holding on to it and navigating the ups and downs without getting completely wiped out.
So how do you do that? Like, how do you avoid becoming a cautionary tale?
Housel boils it down to one word: survival. It's about weathering the storms, avoiding those crazy risks, and sticking to your long-term plan. Like, imagine you're building a house, right?
Okay.
You need a solid foundation to withstand the storms. It's the same thing with your finances. You need that strong base to keep you steady when things get rough.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And I think it also goes back to what we were saying earlier about not equating wealth with like all the fancy things, right? Like cars and houses and all that.
Right. It's about understanding the difference between being rich and wealthy.
Okay.
So rich is having a high income, but wealthy, that's about accumulating assets that give you options and security.
Right.
And, like that saying, rich people drive fancy cars, wealthy people own the car dealerships.
I love that.
It's true, though, wealthy people are a lot harder to spot because they're not focused on showing off. Their wealth is hidden in their savings, their investments, their businesses. They're building something that lasts, not just something that looks good in the moment.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about like saving and investing and building that foundation, but let's be real, saving money is tough, right? Like especially when we're surrounded by messages telling us to spend, spend, spend.
Totally.
How do we actually resist that temptation and make saving money a habit?
It's a great question. And Housel actually has a really interesting analogy that he uses. Think about the 1970s oil crisis.
Okay, yeah, I remember my parents talking about that, like waiting in those long lines at gas stations, yeah.
Exactly. So the world was freaking out, right? Like, we're running out of oil, panic everywhere. But we got through it, not just by finding more oil, but by becoming more energy efficient.
Okay, yeah, I see where you're going with this.
Right.
So like saving is like becoming more financially efficient.
Exactly. It's about controlling your spending.
Yeah.
It's about finding ways to do more with less, increasing your savings efficiency, as he calls it.
I like that term. It's not just about how much you earn, it's about how much you keep,
You got it.
right?
And this is super important, especially today,
Yeah.
when income growth is unpredictable. The pressure to keep up with the Joneses is just relentless.
Oh, it's so true. Like everybody wants to have the latest gadgets, the fancy vacations, the perfect Instagram life.
Right. And it's easy to get caught up in that. But Housel reminds us that building wealth is more about what you keep, not what you earn.
So how do we actually get better at this whole savings efficiency thing? Like, where do we even start?
Well, this is where Housel makes another interesting point, and it might seem a little counterintuitive.
Hmm.
He says that it's okay to be reasonable with your money, not always perfectly rational. And to illustrate this, he tells this amazing story about Julius Wagner Jauregg, a doctor who cured syphilis
Okay.
by intentionally infecting people with malaria.
Wait, what? That sounds like, how does that even work?
I know, right? It sounds nuts.
Yeah.
But it worked. He actually won a Nobel Prize for it. And Housel uses this story to challenge how we think about what makes a good financial decision.
Mm.
Like, sometimes those unconventional approaches can lead to surprising results.
So it's okay to, like, break the rules sometimes or, like, deviate from traditional financial advice.
Yeah, sometimes, you know.
Yeah.
He's not saying to just throw all the rules out the window. But it's about being flexible, adaptable, maybe even a little bit creative. Like finding what works best for you and your specific situation,
Makes sense.
even if it's not perfectly rational on paper.
This reminds me of that story about Harry Markowitz, the guy who basically invented modern portfolio theory. But like when it came to his own investments, he admitted to just splitting his money 50-50 between stocks and bonds, even though it wasn't mathematically optimal.
I know, right?
Yeah.
You'd think the guy who literally wrote the book on portfolio theory would have some super complicated, optimized portfolio. But no, he kept it simple. Why? Because it gave him peace of mind.
So he was basically choosing peace of mind over like potentially higher gains, right?
Exactly. And I think that's a really important lesson because in the end, we're not just managing money, we're managing our emotions too.
Oh, that's such a good point. And it makes me think of another thing that Hustle talks about, the power of narratives and expectations.
Oh, yes. Like how much our beliefs and stories shape our financial reality.
Right. Like he uses that awesome analogy about an alien observing Earth's economy,
Oh, yeah.
right? And the alien sees the same activity, the same technology in 2007 and 2009. But like in 2007, everything is booming. And then in 2009, the economy totally crashes.
Why?
Like the alien doesn't understand because the only thing that changed was the story we told ourselves about the economy.
It's true. It shows how powerful our beliefs are. You know, if we believe something is going to happen, we tend to act in ways that make it more likely to happen.
Oh, that's so interesting. Like if everyone believes the economy is going to crash, then it becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
Exactly. And it doesn't just apply to like the overall economy. It applies to our own personal financial narratives too. If you're constantly telling yourself, I'll never be able to buy a house or investing is too risky, then yeah, those beliefs are going to shape your actions.
Right. So it's really important to become aware of those narratives, like those stories we tell ourselves about money, and then like actively challenge them if they're not actually true.
For sure.
Hmm.
If you want to change your financial reality, you've got to start by changing the story you're telling yourself about money. And that leads us to another super important concept that Housel emphasizes,
Yeah.
room for error.
Okay.
And he tells this crazy story about this guy named Clarence Hughes, who went to the dentist for like a simple procedure and woke up missing 16 teeth and his tonsils.
Oh my gosh. That's terrifying. Like that would be a nightmare.
Oh, I know. But the point of the story is to show how important it is to have clear communication, especially when it comes to something as important as your finances.
Okay. Yeah. Like always get a second opinion, right?
Totally. But it goes even deeper than that. Room for error is about acknowledging that like nothing is certain.
All right.
You can have the most amazing plan, but life can throw you a curveball.
Right.
And it's about having the flexibility and the resilience to adapt.
Because like no matter how much we plan, sometimes things just go wrong.
Right, exactly. So how do you build in that room for error?
Okay. Yeah. How do you actually do that?
Well, start by being honest with yourself about your assumptions.
Okay.
Are you overestimating how much money you'll make next year? Are you maybe underestimating your expenses? Are you putting all your eggs in one basket, relying on a single source of income?
Yeah. Those are all good questions to ask yourself for sure.
Right. And then it's about building in those buffers and safety nets that we talked about, like saving a little more than you think you need,
Right.
diversifying your investments,
Okay.
having a solid emergency fund. All these things help create a margin of safety so that when something unexpected happens, you're not completely derailed.
So it's like having shock absorbers on your financial journey.
Exactly. It's about being prepared for those bumps in the road,
Yeah.
knowing they're inevitable,
Right.
and having a strategy to navigate them.
Okay. And, all of this makes me think about another really important concept that Housel talks about, the price of investing. Like, I
Yeah.
feel like a lot of people, especially people who are new to investing, they don't really get this.
It's true. It's something that we all got to understand, and he uses a really good analogy to explain it. Think about buying a car.
Okay.
You wouldn't expect to get a brand new car for free, would you?
Of course not. You got to pay for it.
Right. So investing is kind of the same way. We pay a price for the potential to grow our money over the long term. And that price is volatility.
Yeah.
It's uncertainty. It's the possibility that we might even lose money in the short term.
Yeah, and that's what makes a lot of people nervous, right? Like seeing their money go down is scary.
Totally. But Housel argues that we should view this price not as a fine, but as a fee.
I love that reframing. A fee, not a fine.
It changes the whole perspective, right? It's like paying an entrance fee to get into Disneyland. You pay the fee, you get in, and then you get to enjoy all the rides.
Right, right.
Investing is kind of similar. We pay the fee of volatility, but then we get access to the potential for long-term growth.
So instead of freaking out when the market drops, we should just think of it as like, oh, this is just part of the cost of being in the game.
Right, exactly. And once you understand that, you're less likely to panic and make emotional decisions when the market inevitably goes through its ups and downs. You can stay focused on your long-term goals.
Yeah, and I guess like it makes those market drops a little less scary too, right?
It does.
Knowing that it's just like a natural part of the process.
Yeah, totally. And this kind of reminds me of another point that Housel makes about bubbles. You know those times when, like, tech stocks or real estate, they just skyrocket in value?
Yeah. Like everyone is just buying, 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 no matter what.
Exactly. So we tend to think of those times as irrational exuberance, like everyone's lost their minds. But Housel has a different perspective. He suggests that bubbles are often driven by people who are acting rationally. At least they're acting rationally based on their own goals.
So it's not that they're necessarily delusional, it's just that they're playing a different game.
Exactly. They might have shorter time horizons, so they're willing to pay more for assets that are going up right now.
Oh, that's really interesting. So maybe it's not always about people being greedy or like crazy. It's just about understanding their motivations and the rules of the game they're playing.
Right. And that's a key thing to remember because it helps us understand that the market is complex. It's not always black and white.
Yeah, there's a lot of psychology involved,
Absolutely. Yeah.
like way more than we might think. And it's important to be aware of like all those different factors that are driving the market, not just like our own individual investment decisions.
For sure. And speaking of different perspectives, Housel actually spends a lot of time in the book talking about the power of pessimism.
Oh, this should be good. Like, it feels like we're constantly bombarded with negativity these days from like the news, social media, everywhere.
Totally. And Housel makes the point that pessimistic narratives are often more persuasive than optimistic ones.
Why do you think that is? Like, why are we so drawn to the negative?
Well, one reason is that money is such a universal thing.
Mm.
When something bad happens in the economy, it can affect everyone, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like a hurricane might only impact a certain region, but a recession can have ripple effects across the entire globe.
So it makes sense that we'd be more tuned into those risks that could affect us directly, right?
Exactly. It's like our survival instincts kicking in. Another reason is that pessimists often have a tendency to just extrapolate current trends. Like, if things are bad right now, they assume they'll only get worse. They don't account for how markets and economies adapt and change over time.
It's like they're taking a snapshot in time and then assuming it'll stay that way forever, right?
Right. And he uses the example of the 2008 oil crisis. So many analysts predicted that we were running out of oil, but they didn't account for the fact that, like, the energy industry is incredibly innovative.
Right.
So as prices rose, new technologies emerged. Production went up.
So they were looking at the problem through like too narrow of a lens.
Exactly. They underestimated the power of human ingenuity and adaptability. And I think that's a common mistake for pessimists. They get so focused on the problems, they don't see the potential solutions.
It's a reminder that like even when things seem bad, there's always hope, right?
Absolutely. We shouldn't let fear and negativity cloud our judgment, especially when it comes to our long-term plans.
And speaking of judgment, I think it's so interesting how Alzo points out that we tend to overestimate how much control we actually have, like especially over our financial outcomes.
Yes. He uses that alien analogy again here.
Oh, yeah.
The alien observes everything, sees all the data, but doesn't understand the stories and the narratives that are driving human behavior.
So it's like, even with all the data in the world, we can't perfectly predict what humans are going to do.
Exactly. We're not as rational as we like to think we are,
Right.
and our decisions are influenced by so many factors that we're often not even aware of. So I think a little humility goes a long way.
I like that. Humility.
Yeah.
Like acknowledging that we don't have all the answers and things might not always go according to plan.
Right. We can't control everything, but we can control how we respond to the things that happen.
And that kind of ties back to building in that room for error, right?
It does. It's about accepting that uncertainty is just a part of life
Yeah.
and making peace with that fact.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but I'm curious, what about Housel's personal philosophy?
Ah, yes. He actually shares quite a bit about that in the final chapter.
Oh, that's great. I always like to hear what people who have been successful have actually done themselves.
Right. And his philosophy is all about finding that balance between risk and security
Okay.
and creating a financial plan that aligns with your own personal goals and values. He's not about chasing the latest trends or trying to get rich quick.
So no crazy investment schemes.
No, he's actually a big advocate for simple, low-cost index funds,
Okay.
which basically you're just buying a basket of stocks that track a specific market index, like the S&P 500.
Yeah.
It's a really easy way to diversify your investments and invest for the long term.
So it's kind of like a set it and forget it
Yeah,
approach.
exactly. But he also acknowledges that, like, if you have the time and the expertise, active stock picking can be a viable strategy too.
So it's really about finding what works best for you. Like, there's no right or wrong answer when it comes to investing.
Absolutely. And above all, I think his message is really about using money as a tool to create a life that has meaning and purpose.
Right. Like, it's not about letting money control you.
Exactly. It's about being in control of your finances.
Right.
So you can live the life that you want.
Yeah. So you can use your money to create a life that actually matters to you.
And I like how he talks about the idea of, like, not seeing wealth. It's like, sometimes we get so caught up in those outward displays of success, right? Like the fancy cars and the big houses.
Yeah, for sure. He makes a great point about that. Like, when you see someone driving a really expensive car, do you ever actually think, wow, that person is so cool?
No, probably not.
Right. Like, more often we're thinking, oh, man, if I had that car, then people would think I'm cool.
Totally. It's like we're projecting our own desires and insecurities onto that object, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. We fall into this trap of thinking that visible spending equals status and admiration.
Mm.
But the reality is, the people who are truly wealthy often don't feel the need to flaunt it.
Okay, so then what's the lesson here? Are we supposed to, like, give up on ever owning a nice car or a beautiful home?
No, not necessarily. Like, it's
Right.
not about denying yourself those things. It's about being mindful of your motivations.
Right.
Like, are you buying that expensive car because you genuinely love cars and it brings you joy? Or are you buying it to impress other people?
Right.
Because, if it's the latter, you're probably setting yourself up for disappointment.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because, like, those external validations, they're so fleeting, right?
Totally. And, true wealth, as
Yeah.
Housel defines it, it's about those options and that freedom that come from having a solid financial foundation.
It's about security and knowing that you have choices and not being stuck in a situation where you're forced to do something you don't want to do because of money.
Right, exactly. It's about having the resources to live a life that's authentically you, regardless of what other people might think.
I like that. And I think a big part of building that kind of wealth, that invisible wealth, comes back to something we talked about earlier, which is saving. Like, I know it sounds boring, but Housel really emphasizes that saving is kind of the secret sauce.
It is. It's like the key ingredient that allows you to achieve all those other financial goals. And, he even argues that saving might be even more important than earning a high income.
Okay, yeah, I remember he compares it to the 1970s oil crisis. It's like we overcame that crisis not by just finding more oil, but by learning to do more with less energy, right?
Exactly. So just like we learn to use energy more efficiently, we can learn to use our money more efficiently.
So it's not just about how much you earn, it's about how much you keep.
Precisely.
Right, okay. And that leads us to something that, at least to me, it sounds a little counterintuitive at first. He says it's okay to be reasonable with your money, not always perfectly rational.
Yeah, I love this point because it's so true.
But wait, didn't we just talk about, like, how important it is to be rational with your finances?
We did. But Housel makes a really important distinction here.
Okay.
Like, being perfectly rational, making decisions solely based on spreadsheets and numbers, that's great in theory.
Right.
But in real life, it's not always realistic or sustainable. Like, we're humans, we have emotions, and those emotions play a huge role in how we think about and manage money.
Right, right.
So being pretty reasonable with your finances, that's often more achievable, more sustainable in the long run.
Yeah.
And to kind of drive this point home, he tells another great story, this time about Julius Wagner Jahreg. He was a doctor who actually cured syphilis
Okay.
by intentionally infecting his patients with malaria.
Wait, what? That sounds crazy. Like, how would that possibly work?
I know, right?
Mm.
It seems completely counterintuitive,
Yeah.
but it worked.
Yeah.
It actually earned him a Nobel Prize. So Housel uses this story to challenge our assumptions about what we consider a good financial decision. Like, sometimes those unconventional approaches, the things that don't make sense on paper, they can actually lead to the best results.
Okay, so are you saying it's okay to, like, ignore traditional financial advice sometimes?
I think it's more about being open to different perspectives and not being afraid to think outside the box.
Mm.
Maybe the traditional advice doesn't fit your particular situation or your goals or your personality.
Right, or
And that's okay. Like, the key is to find what works best for you, even if it's a little unconventional.
that makes sense. And it makes me think of that story we talked about earlier with Harry Markowitz.
Oh, yeah. The guy who basically invented modern portfolio theory.
Right, and then he just splits his own money 50-50 between stocks and bonds.
I know. It's such a great example. Like, here's this brilliant guy, a Nobel Prize winner, and even he recognized that sometimes simplicity and peace of mind are more valuable than trying to optimize every single detail of your portfolio.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that we're not just managing money, we're managing our emotions too.
Right. Like, if he had put all his money in stocks and the market crashed, he'd be a wreck.
Yeah.
So he chose to prioritize his own well-being, and that's something we can all learn from.
Totally. Okay, so speaking of emotions, we can't forget about the power of narratives and expectations, right? Like how those stories we tell ourselves can actually shape our financial reality. And I think Housel's alien observer analogy is just brilliant for explaining this.
Oh, yeah. That's one of my favorite parts of the book.
Okay, so remind us, what's the analogy again?
Okay, so imagine an alien is observing Earth's economy,
Okay.
and they're looking at 2007 and then 2009. They see the same level of economic activity, the same technology, but in 2007, everything is booming, and then in 2009, the economy totally crashes.
Right. And the alien is like, what just happened? Nothing seems to have changed.
Exactly. The alien is completely confused,
Yep.
and the reason is because the only thing that changed between those 2 years was the story we told ourselves about the economy.
Oh, it's crazy how those narratives, those stories, they can have such a powerful effect. Like once the story shifted from optimism to fear, everything changed.
Yeah, and it highlights the power of collective belief. When enough people start believing the same story, it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
And this applies to our own personal narratives about money, too. If you're constantly telling yourself, I'll never be able to afford a house or investing is too risky, then those beliefs will start to shape your actions and they might actually prevent you from achieving your goals.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's really important to become aware of those stories that we're telling ourselves and challenge them if they're not actually serving us. Like, if the story is, I'm bad with money, maybe we need to rewrite that story.
Absolutely. And it leads us to another really crucial concept that Housel emphasizes, which is room for error. Remember that crazy story he tells about the guy, Clarence Hughes, who went to the dentist and woke up missing 16 teeth?
Oh, yeah, that
Yeah.
story is wild and a little disturbing, to be honest. It is. But the point he's making is that we need to be prepared for the unexpected. Like, even when we think we're in control, things can go wrong.
So it's like always get a second opinion, especially when it comes to your finances,
Right.
right?
It's about being cautious and doing your research, but it goes even deeper than that. Room for error is about acknowledging that there's inherent uncertainty in life.
Okay.
Like, no matter how much we plan, no matter how smart we are, life can throw us curveballs.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's like that saying, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plan.
Exactly. So we need to build our plans with that in mind.
Okay, so then how do you actually build in that room for error?
Well, it starts with being honest with yourself about your assumptions. Are you being overly optimistic about how much money you're going to make next year? Are you underestimating your expenses? Are you relying on a single source of income? Those are all things to consider.
So basically, don't get too cocky, right? Like, expect the unexpected.
Yeah, don't assume that everything is going to go perfectly according to plan.
Right.
And then It's about creating those buffers and safety nets, like
Mm.
saving a little more than you think you need, diversifying your investments, having a solid emergency fund.
Oh, yeah, those are all things we've talked about before, and they're all so important. It's about having that cushion so when something unexpected happens, you're not completely thrown off course.
Exactly. It's like having shock absorbers on your financial journey.
I love that. It makes those bumps a lot less jarring.
Yeah. Okay, this kind of reminds me of another really important concept that Housel talks about, which is the price of investing.
Okay, yeah, what is that exactly? Is it just like the fees and taxes that you pay?
Well, it's more than that. He uses this great analogy. Think about buying a car. You wouldn't expect to get a brand new car for free, right?
Of course not. You got to pay for it.
Right. And investing is kind of the same way. We're paying a price for the potential to grow our money over the long term. And that price is volatility. It's uncertainty. It's the fact that our investments might go down in the short term.
Okay, yeah, and that's the part that scares a lot of people away, right? They see their account balance drop and they panic.
I know. But Housel says we should think of this price not as a fine, but as a fee.
Ooh, I like that. A fee, not a fine.
Right. It's like paying an entrance fee to get into Disneyland. You pay the fee, and then you get to enjoy all the rides.
So volatility is just the cost of admission to the markets.
Precisely. And the potential payoff is that long-term growth, the financial freedom, the ability to reach your goals. So when the market goes down, don't think of it as a punishment.
Yeah, it's just the price you pay to play the game.
Exactly. And once you understand that, it becomes a lot easier to ride out those ups and downs and stay focused on the long term.
Right, right. It's like you got to be in it to win it.
Exactly. Okay, and speaking of, like, market psychology, Housel makes this really interesting point about bubbles. You know those times when, like, tech stocks or real estate just skyrocket in value?
Yeah, like everyone is just buying, 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 no matter what the price is.
Right. So we tend to think of those times as irrational exuberance, right? Like everyone's lost their minds. But Housel suggests that maybe those bubbles are actually driven by people acting rationally, at least based on their own goals and time horizons.
So it's not that they're delusional, it's just that they're playing a different game.
Exactly. Maybe they have shorter time horizons, so they're willing to pay more for those assets that are going up right now.
Oh, that's a really interesting way to look at it. So maybe it's not always about people being greedy or crazy. It's just about understanding their motivations and the rules of the game they're playing.
Exactly. And that's why it's important to remember that the market is complex. There are all these different factors at play, all these different perspectives.
Okay, yeah, it's definitely not as simple as it might seem on the surface.
Definitely not. And speaking of different perspectives, Housel actually spends a lot of time in the book talking about the power of pessimism.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Because it feels like we're just bombarded with negativity these days, right? Like from the news, social media, everywhere.
Totally. And Housel points out that pessimistic narratives are often more persuasive than optimistic ones.
Why do you think that is? Like, why are we so drawn to the negative?
Well, I think there are a few reasons. One is that money is so closely tied to our lives. And when something bad happens in the economy, it can affect pretty much everyone, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's like a hurricane might only impact a specific region, but a recession can have ripple effects across the entire globe.
So it makes sense that we'd be more attuned to those potential threats, right? Like our survival instincts kicking in.
Right, exactly. It's like we're wired to pay more attention to the things that could potentially harm us. And another reason is that pessimists often have a tendency to just, like, extrapolate current trends. They see things going bad right now and they just assume it's going to keep getting worse.
Yeah, like they're looking at a snapshot in time and assuming it represents the whole picture.
Exactly. And he uses the example of the 2008 oil crisis to illustrate this. So, a lot of analysts were predicting that the world was running out of oil
Yeah.
and that prices were going to keep skyrocketing.
Mm.
But what they failed to account for was that the energy industry is incredibly innovative and adaptable. So as prices went up, new technologies emerged, new sources of oil were discovered, and production actually soared.
So they were looking at the problem through like way too narrow of a lens.
Exactly. They underestimated the power of human ingenuity. And that's a common blind spot for pessimists, I think.
Mm-hmm.
They tend to focus on the challenges without acknowledging the potential for positive change.
It's a good reminder that even when things seem really bad, there's always hope, and we shouldn't let that fear and negativity paralyze us.
That's such a great point. And it all kind of ties back to this idea that we tend to overestimate how much control we have over our financial outcomes.
Yeah.
Like, remember that alien observing Earth's economy?
Yeah.
It sees all the data, but it doesn't understand the stories and the narratives that are driving human behavior.
So even with all the data in the world, it's impossible to perfectly predict what humans are going to do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really humbling realization. We like to think we're in control, but the reality is there are so many factors that influence our decisions, both conscious and unconscious.
Right. So it's about having a little humility, acknowledging that we don't have all the answers, and things might not always go according to plan.
Yeah. And that's where that room for error comes in.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground with Housel's ideas, but I'm curious to hear about his own personal philosophy when it comes to money and investing.
Yeah, so he actually shares quite a bit about that in the final chapter.
Oh, cool. Like,
Yeah.
I always like to hear what people who have been successful have actually done themselves.
Me too.
Yeah.
And his approach is really about finding a balance between risk and security
Okay.
and creating a financial plan that's aligned with your own values and goals. He's not about chasing the latest trends or trying to get rich quick.
So no crazy investment schemes.
No. He actually advocates for a pretty simple approach, focusing on low-cost index funds.
Okay, yeah, I've heard of those. Like, it's basically just buying a basket of stocks that track a specific market index, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So like the S&P 500. It's a really easy way to diversify your investments and just invest for the long term without having to pick individual stocks.
Okay, so it's kind of like a set it and forget it approach.
Yeah, pretty much. But he also acknowledges that, if you have the time and the expertise, active stock picking can be a viable strategy too.
So again, it's about finding what works best for you. Like, there's no one size fits all answer.
Totally. And above all, I think his message is about using money as a tool to create a life that has meaning and purpose.
Okay, yeah. It's not about letting money control you.
Right. It's about being in control of your finances so that you can live the life that you want. And he makes another really interesting point, which is be nicer and less flashy.
Okay, explain that one.
So he argues that no one is as impressed with your possessions as you are. Like, we buy these fancy things thinking it'll make us happy or impress other people.
It's like we're trying to keep up with the Joneses.
Exactly. But, people are way more focused on their own insecurities and aspirations than they are on our stuff.
It's so true. Like, we think everyone is paying attention to what we have, but they probably aren't even noticing.
And it's not just about material possessions either. It's about our attitudes and behaviors too. Like, being humble, kind, and empathetic will always be more attractive than being arrogant and flashy.
It's about building genuine connections, not superficial ones based on what you own.
Exactly. And I think that brings us to the heart of what Housel is trying to convey in The Psychology of Money. It's not about mastering complicated financial formulas or finding some secret get-rich-quick scheme.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the deeper forces that drive our financial decisions, both the rational and the emotional.
Yeah, and it's about, recognizing that our relationship with money is complicated. It's not always rational.
Right.
There are emotions involved.
Absolutely.
There's psychology involved, and, there's no one-size-fits-all approach, right?
Totally.
Like, what works for one person might be a total disaster for someone else.
Exactly.
So I think it's about, being mindful,
Right.
intentional,
Yeah.
and even compassionate
Absolutely.
in your approach to money, right?
Yeah.
Towards yourself and towards others.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I think, sometimes we can be so hard on ourselves when it comes to money.
Oh, totally.
We make mistakes and we beat ourselves up about it.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that everyone's journey is different.
Right.
And there's no right or wrong way to do it.
Yeah. It's all about learning and growing,
Right.
figuring out what works best for you.
Exactly.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into the psychology of money, I'm curious,
Yeah.
what's your biggest takeaway from the book? Like, what's the one message that you really hope our listeners will take away from this conversation?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I think for me, the most important thing is to remember that money is a tool.
Okay.
It's not the end goal.
Right.
It's a means to an end.
Right.
It's up to us to decide how we use it.
Right. It's about, making conscious choices
Absolutely.
that are aligned with, what we truly value.
Yeah, I love that.
Right. And it's not always easy.
No, it's
There are so many temptations,
Right.
so many distractions.
Yeah.
But if we can just keep that bigger picture in mind,
Right.
and remember what truly matters to us,
Right.
then I think, we're much more likely to make those choices that actually lead to a fulfilling life.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the psychology of money.
It was my pleasure.
I always learn so much from our conversations, so we hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And we'll see you next time for another deep dive into some fascinating topic.
Can't wait.
All right, take care.